Welcome to the mini lecture on Chapter 8. In this chapter, we will be reviewing some of the different levels of regional economic integration and how the integration impacts our economic and political environments. Now, in order to gain a full understanding of the topic, you should make sure that you read the chapter. Now, when we talk about regional economic integration, we're basically talking about a set of agreements between countries in which preferential trade policies have been put into place. And these agreements may provide for the partial or complete removal of duty rates, removal of trade barriers. They may provide for greater efficiency in the transportation of products and the sharing of the factors of production. Now remember, in earlier business classes, when we spoke of the factors of production, we were talking about resources that, when combined by industry, provided the building blocks for profit. And factors of production include things like natural resources, labor, knowledge, entrepreneurship, and capital. And energy has also recently been added. Now, back in 1993, the European Union was formed. And when you look at a map of Europe, you can see that there are many small countries, and some of those countries are landlocked. In a typical customs environment, duty and other taxes may be paid every time it travels from one country to another. Now, in an example where a seller in Latvia is sending their product to a buyer in Spain, you can see where the burden of import duty would be excessive on the product as it enters and leaves all the countries in between Latvia and Spain. Now, ultimately, the countries of Europe found that if they could agree on certain trade procedures and certain trade rules, then the movement of cargo would be quicker, easier, and cheaper for all. Now, as the European Union or the European countries moved to form a more united trade environment, it also united under a single currency, the euro. And it was intimidating for the United States because the United States had enjoyed a long period of time when its economy dominated the world market. Now, after the integration of the European countries, the United States now had to compete differently. Now, today the European Union has a population of over 500 million people. Now, a year after the formation of the European Union, the United States entered into an agreement with Canada and Mexico, which was called the North American Free Trade Agreement. Nafta is considered a free trade area, and the agreement is the least of the integrated economic forms. Now, basically, it means that trade barriers, the import duties, subsidies, quotas, and other administrative requirements are waived for those countries that are included in Nafta, which applies to Canada, Mexico, and the United States. That doesn't mean that the United States cannot act alone in forming its own trade policies. Now, a customs union is a little more stringent. Customs union is a little more stringent in terms of trade practices. In a customs union, not only is there a common trade agreement, but the group of countries will form a single external trade policy. And a country would not make that decision without careful consideration for what lies ahead. After all, a country would not feel comfortable in joining with other countries to set external trade policy unless they were already thinking about becoming a unified political group. Now, countries that participate in a common market are even more closely related than a customs union. In a common market, there are no trade barriers among the member countries. There is a set external trade policy, and the factors of production are shared by all the member countries. And it can take years or decades to form a common market. The level of negotiation and cooperation that must exist between member countries is extraordinary. For instance, countries that have a common market integration strategy now must also agree on significant immigration policies, monetary policies, and employment law. Now, if we take the common market concept a step further and attempt to establish an economic union, we are now operating in an environment where a common currency is required. Anything involving tax rates, monetary policy, or fiscal policy must be consistent across the entire alliance. Even in the case of the European Union, there are still countries that hold on tightly to their own currency. Now, in addition, there are some countries that still carry their own tax rate structures. But let's think about this on a practical level. Any country that is part of an economic union no longer has full control over its tax structures. It must work with other countries to pass any sort of employment, or immigration policy, and each country that is involved has now surrendered a great deal of sovereignty, and most countries are not interested in a deal like that. Now, the final stage of integration involves a political union, and once a political union is formed, the participating countries now look to a single central government that coordinates and directs all the economic, social, and foreign policy. Now, since the countries have already given up a significant amount of sovereignty upon the forming of the economic union earlier in their relationship, the political union now requires them to be responsible for a central government that oversees important economic functions of the member countries. Now, in any case where the political union will also operate as some type of democracy, this central political structure may also be elected by the citizens of the involved countries. And when we look at the pros and cons of regional integration, we have to look at it from a practical standpoint as well. It is difficult to get the representative governments of individual nations to reach agreements regarding policies even among themselves. How much more difficult would it be to get the governments of many nations to agree on central structures? And ultimately, there are limited resources. Each country wants to be assured that they'll get their fair share. It's difficult to get all nations to agree on important accesses to the resources. And that is why you do not see large amounts of effort being put in the direction of forming political unions. Now, one of the positive side effects of forming a political union is that each individual country is now stronger when viewed as part of the collective. So small countries may not be able to negotiate on equal footing with a larger country. However, if those smaller countries join forces and become a political union, then they have a better chance of getting what they want. And regional integration is not a win-win scenario for everyone. Some stakeholders are going to pay the price. For example, even though the countries involved in the regional integration may be joined by common economic considerations, individual countries may still have to sacrifice in important areas. When Nafta was created, some U.S. jobs were lost because it now became easier to manufacture goods in Mexico where the labor costs were lower. Another problem can arise due to self-interest. For example, in a regional integration scenario, a country may attempt to move independently to protect itself if it feels that it is at a disadvantage in the agreement. And when we look at the European Union, we see several strong countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, and France are having to hyper-extend their financial reach in order to protect the failing political or the failing economic policies of the smaller countries. So you have to think about it from the perspective that the United Kingdom, Germany, and France may grow tired from the additional responsibilities they have incurred in protecting economic interests of smaller countries. When one of the problems with political integration involves the issues surrounding trade creation and trade diversion. When we think about the reasons that businesses engage in trade, or even countries for that matter, the dominant reasons include expanding market share in a new market and, of course, cost reductions. So trade creation occurs naturally when a company replaces a high-cost provider with a low-cost provider. And this is normal in that it helps us to enjoy the lowest possible prices on the consumer level. Now, as a concept, this is wonderful. There will always be a flight to the low-cost producer when we are looking for lower costs. But the problem is that in a regional integration plan, a high-cost producer may be preferred over a low-cost producer. If the low-cost producer is outside the regional integration structure, there's a good possibility they will lose that business merely because the regional partner is preferred. And this will result in higher costs to the consumer. So in order to evaluate whether an integration strategy is actually working on a regional level, we have to analyze the trade flows between the countries over a period of time. So Chapter 8 goes into a pretty good level of detail regarding the trade blocks. So you should read the text to gain a better understanding of these alliances. And this includes the mini lecture on Chapter 8.